Et Glenn Williams va nous emmener en Australie.
Glenn Williams is going to take us to Australia.
Directeur de TREENET.
So you're head of a TREENET association, and it is a network for research and for educational purposes as well on the memorial and roads. So the floor is yours.
Merci. Bonjour. Thank you, Chantal. Oh, I love trees. I love avenues. Thank you, Chantal, for your kind invitation. And thanks to all the speakers from yesterday who really set the scene with your wonderful presentations. And I'm sure I'm just going to echo some of your observations that you made yesterday. To illustrate some of the motivation for creating TREENET's Avenues of Honour project, I'm going to refer to some key dates. I'll try to demonstrate how the project and why the project works and how we're trying to chronicle all the avenues in Australia. Hopefully you'll see how the project has become a national shopfront for recognition of local projects at a national level, and perhaps for reasons of sentiment and commemoration that people might come to value and understand trees in the landscape just a little more. I want to lead you into the Avenues of Honour project by first giving you an introduction to TREENET for some context. TREENET is a national not-for-profit environmental organisation, and we're committed to promoting the environmental benefits of trees in urban environments. We sustain a major network of urban tree enthusiasts from all walks of life, within all levels of government, but particularly local government, as well as from the corporate sector, like-minded industry groups, and not-for-profit associations. Our entire core funding is sustained through voluntary membership subscriptions drawn from this broad network of supporters. And whether or not they care to admit it, TREENET fans are all essentially tree huggers. Our work on special projects like Avenues of Honour is mostly supported by philanthropy, the generosity of individuals who share our values and have confidence in our aims. And a modest biannual contribution comes in the form of some royalties from the sale of Gallipoli rosemary plants. We get excited about street trees, trees in parklands, trees in front yards and backyards, and we're equally excited about the research and education that underpins the enormous range of services that trees provide. And all this as a basis for sustaining livable towns and cities. We all know there are universal consequences for loss of trees in the landscape. So much so that TREENET coined this motto: a city without trees isn't fit for a dog. In the landscape, whether naturally or by design, there are trees that are extra special, and they have special stories to tell, and they link us to our history. Such trees take on quite a significance because they're no longer common everyday trees. In partnership with the National Trusts of Australia, TREENET subscribes to their rigorous criteria for identifying special merit trees. And included in that criteria are particular criteria for those that denote or commemorate a special person or event. For example, this is an avenue of oaks that were planted by school children on Arbor Day 1938. It was commemorating the coronation of Britain's King George VI in 1937. And the trees were raised from acorns collected in Great Windsor Park in England and sent to Australia for just this purpose. This intact 19th century carriageway of river red gums, a native Australian species, in the Barossa region of South Australia is now about 160 years old. Now, using an Australian native tree species for the functional purpose of a carriageway, well, this is probably the earliest such avenue using native trees still in existence in Australia today. This historic Dutch elm avenue was planted as a landscape feature in 1928, and I'm proud to say it's a backdrop to TREENET's home at the Waite Arboretum, University of Adelaide. Of course, there are trees that have a particular category for commemoration to do with war service, sacrifice and suffering. And this is, of course, a very significant and pivotal part of Australia's history. The beginnings of TREENET's Avenues of Honour project includes this shared experience and a personal story. The project is embedded in Anzac Day commemoration, the 25th of April. Coincidentally, the founder of Avenues of Honour project, my colleague David Laurie, was born on the 25th of April 1948. 33 years earlier, in 1915, the Gallipoli landings had begun, along with the Anzac tradition and Australia's direct engagement in the European theatre of war. The 25th of April was also the starting point for the eventual tally of significant casualties for Australians at war. So during this war, 156,000 Australians were gassed, wounded or taken prisoner, 62,000 were killed, and 46,000 of those still lie here in French soil. With Australia's shores so remote from Europe, no capacity to repatriate bodies back home or have burial services back home, the planting of trees by grieving families and communities provided tangible personal memorials for loved ones and mates whose actual graves were way out of reach. The uptake of planting poignant living memorials became understandably widespread. The World War I memorial avenues, planted along roadsides, streets, parks, began as early as June 1915, the tradition expanding rapidly throughout the war and in the decades following. You've seen this slide before. This is the Main Street section of the little village of Yamundi in Queensland, where the community rallied to plant 20 trees for 20 soldiers from the district. Out of a total of 87 men who enlisted, these 20 did not return. And the young fig trees were protected by little white picket fences. This is an example of a replacement tree planted many years later to keep the memory alive. At TREENET's first symposium in 2000, a core desire to retain trees in the landscape is discussed. A vision posed for treescapes in Australia promotes the need to understand trees as major community assets and therefore to be properly valued and managed. Included in this vision was an insistence that there be more trees, not less, that there be more avenues and boulevards, not less. And during that discussion, a casual question was asked, what about the historical war memorial avenues? Where are they? Now, in answer, many Australians would nominate this iconic 22-kilometre World War I Ballarat Avenue of Honour in regional Victoria. The route from Adelaide to Melbourne, via Ballarat and the long line of almost 4,000 trees, and through the arch, was well travelled by South Australians. And this was particularly the case for David Laurie, who as a nurseryman and landscape gardener in the 1970s went on a regular pilgrimage in search of new stock. And with a degree of sadness, he understood that each of the trees lining the road represented the service and sacrifice of so many young and cherished lives engaged in conflict, far from home and loved ones. So, at the symposium, reconnecting with this avenue, he thought about his Uncle Claude, his mother's brother. And I'd like to introduce you to Uncle Claude. Claude was 19 when Great Britain declared war and sought military assistance from its allied Commonwealth nations. In 1915, now aged 20, he enlisted to serve abroad. He celebrated his 21st birthday in Egypt and was drafted into the 48th Battalion and sent to France. He served the 48th with distinction at Pozières, Gueudecourt in 1916, Bullecourt, Messines and Passchendaele in 1917, Denoncourt, Monument Wood and Le Verguier in 1918. And although he'd been wounded several times, he remained in the field until the battalion was eventually stood down by General Monash. He then assisted the 27th US military infantry as an intelligence officer for the assault on the Hindenburg Line on the 27th of September, and he was mortally wounded in the early hours of the attack. He was the last soldier of the 48th Battalion to make that supreme sacrifice. Just over a month later, on the 11th of November, armistice was declared, marking the end of combat. Uncle Claude was a man his nephew would never meet. David reflected on the story of his uncle's service and sacrifice in France, as well as his mother's anguish in its telling. He wondered if Claude had a memorial tree, and determined he jolly well should, along with all his World War I mates. And this became a compelling call to TREENET, and so the Avenues of Honour project was conceived. Now, up until yesterday, TREENET claimed that more than any other people, Australians have chosen to recognise war service and sacrifice through the planting of living memorials. Well, Angelo has now completely blown away that myth. Nevertheless, how did TREENET go about supporting its claim? And in the absence of basically no national centralised database for Avenues of Honour information, TREENET took on the responsibility of creating one. Sarah Cockrell, a university student in Adelaide, was secured by David to accelerate his research. Firstly as a volunteer and then eventually supported by a PhD scholarship, Sarah embarked on further research dedicated to Australia's memorial avenues. The 10 or so years leading up to the centenary of World War I saw a groundswell of public interest in this commemorative period, and it offered TREENET a unique opportunity to engage with the broader Australian community and promote and launch the National Avenues of Honour 1915-2015 project. The project launched in 2004, earlier media promotions and word of mouth elicited further information and interest from the public and other parties. In 2006, Ben Kenyon, a supporter of TREENET, formalised the structure for a geospatial database, and he described the types of information it could contain, how it might be presented and accessed. The information gathered from various sources during this period of the project identified 567 known living memorial sites across Australia. Over 400 of those were planted, actual avenues were planted during World War I or its aftermath, many of which remained in some form. Some were depleted and some were in poor condition. The current number of TREENET records is now almost 600. Late in 2012, I was conscripted by David Laurie to join the TREENET ranks, and we explored ways to accelerate community activity and the further discovery of avenues. And a new wiki-style website was initiated. The digitally mapped locations and snapshot summaries of the avenues, I guess the avenues became more accessible for the first time. And blog-style communications stimulated more information. But a critical and vexing issue, however, was TREENET's desire but lack of capacity to be able to link Avenues of Honour and trees to the actual people commemorated and their stories and their service history. In mid-2016, a successful Australian government grant solved the issue, allowing TREENET's Living Memorials database to be integrated with a marvellously versatile, interactive, web-based platform, the Virtual War Memorial. Living memorials can be filtered. You can explore the avenue descriptions, and you can find links, where possible, to the trees, plaques, and the service history of those commemorated. TREENET has now forged an ongoing and collaborative relationship with the Virtual War Memorial. And to complement this relationship, we launched a new Avenues of Honour website in September this year to reinforce the expected benefits for the community. I think it's TREENET's job to applaud and inspire those that take on tasks to generate avenues in the landscape and to discover local champions for local projects as a key for success. For example, this young woman became a powerhouse advocate, a local historian, attempting to save the remaining trees of one of the first avenues of honour planted in Australia. These wonderful enthusiasts discovered a lost avenue, still intact in a suburban street. Their efforts gained secure recognition from a local government authority, and they were acknowledged at a community ceremony on Anzac Day. A local leader and facilitator negotiated this linear parkland site for a major new World War I Avenue of Honour, so that the avenue would live a full life free from threats of development, roadways and other infrastructure. It's important for TREENET to identify partners such as government and community who can support our shared journey. And in this respect, TREENET has had some direct influence in the establishment of new avenues, such as Port Adelaide's Westport Reserve. This is a recent planting for the first 58 soldiers, and more sites being planned to accommodate another 490 trees. Seeing value in association with TREENET, the Queensland Family History Society requests the use of our header branding for their 9-month series of articles about avenues for their magazine. Our Avenues of Honour logo proudly appears on interpretive signs. In 2007, a City Council commissions a report as part of the Avenues project to chronicle their 24 living memorial sites. In 2014, we contribute to a culturally significant trees assessment and management guidelines publication. What I'm illustrating is that over all this type of activity over time, TREENET's Avenues of Honour project has become a national platform for exposing and encouraging local efforts at a national level. The restoration of memorial avenues and plantings of new ones continues to happen in spite of TREENET. We're not responsible for that, because it always did and it always will. And primarily this is because of the drive of ordinary citizens, community groups, key organisations, and particularly supported by sympathetic public land management authorities. We take our inspiration from communities right across Australia, and I'd like just to showcase a couple of those. This is the Soldiers Memorial Avenue that Chantel has alluded to in Hobart, Tasmania. It was suggested to Hobart City Council that they build a memorial avenue, and preparation began in the winter of 1918. Working bees were organised and attracted families, friends, co-workers and soldiers. The biggest working bee had 8,000 people out of a population of just 29,000. And a total of 510 trees were planted and dedicated between 1918 and 19, and a further 25 trees in 1926. As family generations faded, so too did this remarkable site, that for too many years later suffered neglect, mismanagement and loss of historic association. All the original plaques have been removed, leaving the trees anonymous and unnamed. And in some places the encroaching bushland vegetation had swallowed up whole sections of the avenue. The volunteers group was formed to turn back the tide of degradation. The aim was simple: for every soldier a tree, for every tree a plaque. Just going to fast forward now. This is another site. In 2018, the Avenues of Honour project with our new logo remains committed to the promise to remember them all and strives to be a reminder of the pathway to peace. In conclusion, you might find this little village in Queensland, Tanimurral, of interest. A former coal mining town in the late 19th century and a population of about 600, the little village now has less than 200 residents, and most of the built fabric has long gone. But the avenue of 51 London plane trees for World War I commemoration still survives. There are some knobbly bumps on the trunks of some of the trees, presumably just nature at work. Here's another tree with similar defects. On closer inspection, an original memorial copper plaque affixed to a steel cross. Presumably spiked into the soil at the base of the young seedling when planted, it's now embedded in the trunk at a height of 1.6 metres. The tree commemorates Private James Bravery of the 26th Battalion, one of two brothers who died on the Western Front. The tree survives, but there's always the danger of Private James's memory being lost yet again. In all avenues of honour, the trees are the living messengers of the millions of many nations who have died in service. Don't let them die twice, is their cry. From me as director and David as founder, thank you, Chantal, for giving TREENET this opportunity, and thank you to all for your kind attention.